Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to this. It's the fourth Live Green UK Sustainability webinar. Live Green has been working on a draft Live Beyond Zero vision and commitment for climate and environmental action from the UK live music community. It's gone through a few different stages and iterations, working groups, steering groups, and these webinars are really part of a wider consultation with you as the live music community to go over what the vision is, what it means for different parts of the live sector, and how we get there. So these webinars are part of your opportunity to hear more and also ask questions. So please do ask your questions, share your thoughts using the chat, and we'll see them come up and we'll try and get through as many of them throughout the next hour as possible. So today's spotlight is on venues. You can watch back the previous 3 sessions on festivals, touring and offices. And while tomorrow we're going to look at artists and management at 11:30. If you have tuned into any of the others, we have designed each of the sessions to be standalone. So the next 15 minutes or so are going to be a bit of a repeat. So if you've seen them before, I'd encourage you to instead take those 15 minutes to note down a list of 3 things that you're going to do after this session finishes and by when, and at least 2 people that you're going to speak to about climate action. So once you've done that, if you're feeling up to it, you can share those planned actions in the chat here so others also see what you're planning to do. Might be a way to get a bit of accountability for your peers to hold you to your words. But yeah, otherwise, again, feel free to use the chat at any point to ask questions. So my name is Chiara. I work at a charity called Judy's Bicycle. I've been part of one of the working groups which has supported the Live Beyond Zero vision, and also with me is Natalie Kandel. She's a freelance tour manager and event manager. During the pandemic, she's been researching sustainability in live music through an Arts Council Developing Your Creative Practice grant. And as part of that, she's the sustainability manager at the new independent venue Future Yard. So thanks very much for joining, Natalie.
Thank you for having me.
So she'll be talking a little bit about what Future Yard is doing later on in the session. So Judy's Bicycle was founded nearly 15 years ago for within the UK music industry to support the industry to take action on climate change and other environmental challenges. We still do that and also work with the wider performing and visual arts and more through consultancy. We do certification for offices, venues, festivals, and tours. We do research, training, and support getting new networks and programs to get off the ground. So thanks to Greg and Live Green for asking us to lead these workshops. And of course, thanks to everyone tuning in, especially at this moment while everything still feels quite upside down. So we'll go to the presentation now, if we might. Brilliant. So this is at the moment the draft vision. This is not a rehearsal. We commit to a regenerative future, taking the lead on climate action and collaborating towards a sustainable society. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2030. We'll work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. So some of that hopefully sounds a bit more inspirational. Some of it sounds a little bit more technical. And what we've really tried to do in the working group is tread that fine line between something that, again, we can all get really excited to get on board with, but something that is also solid enough to sort of meet the standards of what a good environmental statement and commitment looks like, so that we can avoid sort of accusations of greenwashing. And the reason really we're all here, I think, is because we're in the middle of doing a massive experiment with our only home. Climate change is down to human activity, and the headlines this week, I think, are getting to quite a few of us. The heat wave in the US, the weird tropical-like rain that we've been having here, flooding in Germany, flooding in Russia. So I hope if you have friends or relatives in any of these places, that they're okay. And the reason all of this is happening is that we're burning through energy that's been stored up by plants over millions of years, and we're doing that in the space of about 100 years. If you imagine the atmosphere as a bathtub, with all the taps running, we've also added some extra taps and are using a bucket to put more water into it, or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, way more than the natural sinks and sort of natural processes can remove. So that means the bathtub, the atmosphere is filling up with greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases, like their name suggests, they heat up the atmosphere. So it's now hotter than it's been in the history of human civilization. We're sort of really quickly leaving behind what we know. And the climate won't stop changing until we stop putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So this is a little bit of a one-way process, but it is up to us to decide how much worse it's going to get. And it's not really an overstatement to say that the decisions that we make now are kind of going to set the course for the next millennium on this planet. And climate change sort of affects and interacts with every single other priority we have, from the food we eat to water we drink, where we live, how we can live. When you get heat waves like the ones that are happening in the US now, it's not just plants that die and crops fail. It's people who don't have air conditioning, that are sweltering in their homes, that aren't built for that kind of heat. Roads are buckling and public transport systems are going down, again, because all of that infrastructure hasn't really been built to deal with those temperatures. And it really exacerbates existing inequalities and social rights issues in our communities. Like, poor neighborhoods tend to be several degrees hotter in cities because there's less green space. Homeless people are more likely to die or get hurt by dehydration or heat stress because they have nowhere to seek shelter. People who are precariously employed, say farm workers, often are still told to go out into the fields even when temperatures are sort of going above 40 degrees Celsius. And also other things like a lot of mental health medication can make you more sensitive to heat stress. So people are kind of having to choose whether to stay on their meds or not. So these are issues that really intersect with every single piece of the way that we live. And what matters about how bad climate change is going to get isn't just how much we're putting in a given year, but it's actually how much we've put in total over time. So again, how much are we filling that bathtub? And we have to roughly halve global emissions every decade and get to net zero carbon emissions globally by 2050. So that kind of means that us, the people who are alive and working now, are in charge of solving climate change. And we can see that as something really daunting, or we can take it on as, this is ours to deal with. This is our challenge. This is the opportunity. We get to set that course for what happens now. And that means doing two things. And when I say we, I mainly mean those of us who are living in Europe, North America, other countries that have contributed a lot to historical emissions and are still more responsible for more emissions than people living in other countries, have to cut our impacts. And we also have to push for bigger picture changes in laws and policies and investment. So this idea of net zero that you might have heard about comes from that knowledge that the climate is not going to stop changing until we stop putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We have to get to a point where globally the sources of greenhouse gas emissions have to be equal to or less than the sinks, so the stuff that's taking greenhouse gases back out. And what that means in practice really is reducing emissions as quickly as we can and getting to nearly zero. The net sort of speaks to removing some remaining greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but it's important to understand that we can't just net ourselves out of current levels of emissions. We don't have enough land to plant enough trees. We don't have enough technology. So just relying on those removals would be a little bit like using a cup to try and get water out of the bathtub while we're still using the fire hose to pump water in. So on a whole economy scale, more or less the only thing we're netting out by 2050 is some air travel, some agricultural emissions. So to turn off those sources, it's useful to understand a little bit about where those greenhouse gases come from. The main one is carbon dioxide. It's the most long-lived. It's sort of permanent in the atmosphere on timescales that matter for us. And it's the majority of the emissions that we're causing. And mainly carbon dioxide comes from the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas for energy that we use for electricity, heating, and transport. Another important one is methane, which is stronger, as in it causes more heating than carbon dioxide, but it's pretty short-lived in the atmosphere. It only sticks around for 10 to 15 years. And that mainly comes from agriculture. So cows burping, other livestock burping, and also, for example, from landfill where organic matter is decomposing. So for venues, there's a couple of different drivers for change in terms of action. One is it's the right thing to do. Taking action really is the only thing we can do. Number two is that people are worried. Our staff, our audiences, artists, people we work with are worried. So 8 in 10 people in the UK are very or fairly concerned, and we can respond to that by taking action. Nearly 3 in 4 councils across the UK has now declared a climate emergency. They're pulling together mostly their action plans and policies for what that really looks like in practice. But I think we can expect a lot more requirements and questions to come from local authorities in the future around what businesses that are sort of placed in those local authorities, how you're supporting those climate emergency declarations positively. There's an element of creativity here. How as a venue, how's your venue going to contribute to a livable future? How do we use all these brilliant production and creative skills to contribute, again, to reshaping the way that we live? And collaborating with others, so using venues as laboratories for the zero carbon society that we need to make. There's an element of responding to legislation that's either in place already or coming. If you're a larger venue, you might already be subject to streamlined energy and carbon reporting requirements, for which you have to report energy use. And there's also something here about adapting to climate risks. If you're a venue in the UK, you might remember from a couple of summers ago that when we reach a certain level of heat, it becomes harder to put on shows. A few venues even had to cancel shows in the heat wave in the southeast a few years ago. So summer temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius in the southeast are already becoming more common. At the moment, around once every 5 years, but we could go up to that being the case almost every other year. And lastly, working together. So really, I guess the community that comes from initiatives like Live Green, Beyond Zero's vision, and other shared commitments. So in terms of placing what we're doing in our venues in the context of the big picture, these are some of the scenarios that are used by the Committee on Climate Change, which is a body that informs the UK government on its climate policy. That doesn't mean that these scenarios are exactly what are going to happen. It just means that this is one way of achieving our net zero aims that are in law under the Climate Change Act. So you can think of these as kind of more or less the minimum we have to do over the next 30 years. A lot of people say we actually have to be much more ambitious than this. So one really important area is changing how we make electricity so it's zero carbon. The UK has made a lot of progress on this, but there is some way to go still. And we also have to make more electricity so that we can power all the stuff that we want to shift over to being powered by electricity with that additional renewable electricity. So for venues, that means looking at whether we can install and generate our own renewable power, maybe even becoming part of something like a community energy project, or buying renewable energy via power purchase agreement from a community energy project or other renewable generator, or switching to 100% green electricity tariff from your provider. They aren't all the same, and we'll come back to that in a little while. For your buildings, that's about 17% of emissions today, mainly from heating, gas heating. So a really big shift that is coming over the next 30 years is we have to move away from using gas for our heating. From sometime around 2030, we shouldn't be installing any new gas boilers in commercial buildings. So if your boiler or boilers are up for replacement before then, you can already look at alternatives like air source or ground source heat pumps that use electricity to make heat, or at the very least, keep in mind that somewhere over the next few decades, we have to budget to get our buildings off of gas. In some cases, there might also be so-called district heat networks that are being built by your local authority that you might be able to link your venue to. Another important area is transport. That's the biggest source of emissions in the UK. We've kind of not been able to shift it. It's more or less stayed where it is. So that's a really big area of focus for the next few decades, starting now. So for road and surface transport to get to net zero in the UK means by 2050, there shouldn't be anything that's powered by petrol or diesel on our roads anymore. We're also going to have to drive fewer miles overall. So again, the Committee on Climate Change thinks somewhere between a 7 to 16% reduction in car kilometers driven by 2030. So we should be doing everything we can to work with audiences to incentivize and push them to travel by train, walk, travel by bicycle, public transport, and make driving harder and more expensive. We might even consider marketing to audiences who are better connected to where your venue is by public transport. If you're a venue in a rural location, this is a little bit different because you don't have the kind of public transport infrastructure available that might enable that. But definitely if you're in a city, your number one focus should be how you can help get people out of cars. And second is starting to think about installing electric vehicle charging points. Again, that becomes more important if you're in a rural venue or if you're sort of not as close to public transport. There's something as well about working with suppliers who are tracking their own transport emissions or tackling them by shifting to things like electric freight vans or grouping deliveries. Another area is shifting to a more circular economy. That means using products longer, reusing materials, shifting from materials that have a higher environmental impact to those that have a lower environmental impact. So this is really relevant for any renovation or construction work you're doing or thinking of doing. It's actually a lot better from an environmental and climate perspective to renovate existing buildings than it is to build new ones, even if they're a bit of a headache sometimes around energy efficiency. It's also relevant for any stuff like furniture or consumables that you're using in the venue. So on waste, there's a target to get about a 74% commercial waste recycling rate by 2030. I don't know if you're already getting information from your recycling provider about your recycling rate, but it's useful to start understanding that information a bit more. And another really big one is diverting all biodegradable waste from landfill, again, to get our methane emissions down. So that's really important, for example, if you're serving food, making sure that any food waste is not going to landfill. For agriculture and land use, the main aim in the UK is to free up agricultural land so that we can give it back to nature, use it for other things like tree planting, reforestation, rewilding. And an important part of freeing up that land is reducing how much meat and dairy we eat. So again, there's a few different scenarios around this, but the Committee on Climate Change estimates that we should have potentially reduced how much meat and dairy we eat by up to 40%, so by nearly half by 2050. So there's a real opportunity here for venues to influence change if you're serving food by making sure that you have a lot of plant-based options. And then there's air travel, which is 7% of the UK's emissions today. That doesn't include non-carbon dioxide impacts. We don't have the technology to make flying zero carbon on a timeline to 2050. So every climate strategy and plan has in it this idea of constrained demand growth. So we can't increase the amount that we're flying from now. We might even have to reduce the number of flights we take. So in the UK, half of adults in any given year already don't fly at all. About 15% of people take 70% of all flights. So that's something to consider for our business travel and also for how we're marketing to overseas visitors. A carbon footprint, if you've heard talk of that, is kind of the measure of the climate change impact of a business or an activity or a country or a venue. And it's trying to sum up the climate impact of different activities or things as a single number, usually said as carbon dioxide equivalent, which means the other greenhouse gases have been converted to carbon dioxide equivalents. Some things like burning a litre of diesel have more or less the same carbon footprint wherever you are in the world. They release the same amount of greenhouse gas, but not everything does. So for example, the same venue using the same amount of electricity has a different carbon footprint depending on how that electricity is generated. And that's determined really by where it's located and what is going into the electricity grid. And not everything can be directly measured. So if you ask what the carbon footprint of a tomato is, that depends on how it's been grown and how that land is managed, how the farm machinery is powered, whether it's been grown in a greenhouse that uses energy, and so on and so forth. So the further away you move from that burning of fossil fuels, the more kind of assumptions or estimates that you're depending on in your carbon footprinting. So there is to try and keep some consistency for how businesses report their carbon footprint, there's something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an internationally accepted framework for greenhouse gas accounting. And it tries to place that responsibility for emissions as close to the source of where fossil fuels are burned when it comes to businesses. So your Scope 1 emissions are emissions from owned or operated assets. That's a fancy way of saying things like your gas boilers, where you're burning gas on site, company-owned vehicles or generators, again, that you control or own. Scope 2 is emissions from energy you buy that's generated elsewhere. So for most of you, that's going to be electricity. Scope 3 is the emissions from everything else. So business travel, goods and services you buy, transportation, waste processing, what your investments do, things like audience travel. So it's that sort of, again, other people are burning the fossil fuels to help you do your business, but it's not you making the immediate decisions. That accounting framework of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is sometimes a good way to think of your impacts, but another one is to think in terms of your spheres and levers of control. So what you control directly for a venue, that might be things like how you manage your energy use. What you influence, that might be things like how your audiences are traveling to your venue. And then there's what you don't directly influence, but which still impacts you, where you might want to campaign for bigger picture change, like investment into public transport infrastructure. So coming back to this draft Live UK vision, we commit to a regenerative future, so giving back more than we take, taking the lead on climate action and collaborating towards a sustainable society. So playing our part in that roadmap towards net zero emissions in the UK. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2, and business travel, and reach net zero by 2030. And we're going to work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. So really for the next 10 years, that means focusing on reducing emissions and working with others to reduce theirs and asking for change. It is a commitment that from 2030, you're going to match your remaining emissions with an equivalent of greenhouse gas removals. That's the net. But the net or removals is really the focus after the reductions. So we can also think of that as how live music businesses, events, venues, tours are run, how we role model green investments, technologies, actions, behaviors, how you support the audiences, artists, and others working with you and visiting you to do the right thing, and also then how you use your platforms to call for and support change. So this is the voluntary declaration draft at the moment, which says we will work towards the following: work with Live Green to reduce our operational and business travel greenhouse gas emissions, set reduction targets in line with the Live Green vision, measure and report progress annually, develop a net zero roadmap and action plan, taking responsibility for actions in energy, waste procurement, transport, food and governance, or strategy, understand and define emissions within our value chain. So that's the Scope 3 stuff. Follow best practice to affect change in areas outside of our direct control, working with suppliers and clients towards the Live Beyond Zero vision. Ensure our people undertake climate literacy education and have an ongoing commitment to knowledge sharing within the live music sector and beyond. And talk to our stakeholders honestly about the impacts of our business and on the environment and efforts we're making towards a regenerative future. So for a venue, that basically means measuring and publicly reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and emissions from business travel. So your Scope 1 is going to be your gas use, kilowatt hours, which you can get from utility bills, your refrigerants, usually in kilos, how much you've had to top up every year. If you own or operate any vehicles, how much fuel they're using, or at a push, using mileage to estimate. Scope 2 is the electricity from your utility bills. And business travel is keeping track of flights being taken by your staff, the distance and class, or as a minimum, the number of long haul and the number of short haul flights and what class, the number of hotel nights, keeping track of taxi and staff car mileage and distance of train travel. So yeah, measure, publicly report, so share those on your company website and with Live. Set a 2030 reduction target that covers as a minimum Scope 1 and 2 emissions and business travel, so those areas above, that's in line with the Live Vision and science-based target pathways. So for businesses, there's a few different pathways depending on how big your business is. But a rule of thumb is roughly a 50% reduction every decade from now until 2050 is what we're aspiring to achieve. Develop and follow a roadmap and action plan to achieve reductions. Make sure your staff or crew either have access to climate literacy and learning training, or give permission to them to attend training workshops and be part of information exchange networks. Put climate on the agenda with people you work with, and be part of the Live Green community. So looking at why it can be useful to measure, to manage, these are two example sort of carbon footprints by percent impact by source. So if you compare them, actually their impact hotspots are very different. Venue A is a city centre location, it's medium-sized. Most of its impact really is on the energy side. The majority of audiences are arriving by public transport, so it's relatively a smaller percentage. The second venue is larger, a much lower percentage of people are arriving by public transport. So although energy is still a large part of the carbon footprint, suddenly the audience travel also makes up comparatively more. You will get a copy of these slides afterwards via Live Green. So there's a lot of content on here. I will go through it quite quickly, but if you miss something, you can always watch this back or look at the slides. So for a venue action plan, we're looking at strategy. So really making that commitment to environmental action, making sure everyone you're working with knows about your ambition, making someone responsible for overseeing your commitments, like gathering and reporting the data and coordinating the action. Depending on the scale of your venue, that might be, you know, your job as a venue manager. But if you're a larger venue, you might have someone who has this as part of their official role as a sustainability coordinator or even manager. Putting in place an action plan and environmental policy, so a statement of why this matters to you, what your impacts are, plan for how you're tackling them, and what you want to do. Ideally that you can share with others so they know what you're doing and how they can help. And having that public information page on your website that outlines your commitments and actions. Measuring your impacts and putting in place targets to reduce them. Again, you can start with scopes 1 and 2, business travel, and then have a plan maybe for how you're going to start measuring other areas. You can use the Julie's Bicycles CG tools for venues, which is a free carbon calculator, or you can contact a consultancy for additional support if you need to. Setting a price per ton of emissions can be a useful way to start understanding sort of all the environmental damage we're causing that isn't currently priced. And then you can invest in internal climate projects. So actually create an internal budget for upgrades. You could make equivalent donations to climate justice causes as well in your community. Energy, putting in place an energy management strategy, really focusing on energy efficiency. Management and low cost investment can achieve big savings. Things like switching off fridges overnight, checking heating and cooling schedules, making sure you're not heating and cooling spaces at the same time, maintaining your heating, ventilation, air conditioning filters and systems so they're actually running at optimal performance. And if you are planning any capital development works, making sure they're fit for that zero emissions future, so including LED lighting, looking at options to move off of gas heating, energy efficiency investments like motion sensors, solar shading, insulation, better controls. Scoping the possibility of installing renewables, again, that might not always be feasible, and sometimes the return on investment for renewable energy is not there, and you're better off focusing on the energy efficiency and switching to a green electricity tariff. On transport and travel, putting public transport and cycling info first, making sure people see it. You can, especially if you're a larger venue, but really any size venue, doing an audience survey to understand where people are traveling from and how, and therefore how you might get more of them to shift to public transport, walk or cycle. Even looking at things like, you know, when your show and set times end, and whether that means that people are too late to take some key public transport routes. Working with suppliers to reduce their transport impacts, again, asking them whether they're investing in electric vehicles or what their plans are. And if you do a lot of international business travel, looking at where it might be reduced year round. If you do have to flying economy where possible, because business and is nearly 3 times, and first class nearly 4 times the impacts. On procurement and partners, again, working with suppliers and partners who share your ambition. A lot of venues have started sending out questionnaires for their key suppliers, sort of asking them what their own commitments are and how they might support yours. Putting in place environmental conditions in some key contracts with partners and creating some minimum standards for things that you buy a lot of. If it's paper, it might be post-consumer recycled paper. If it's for your food and catering service, things like Soil Association Organic. Again, so having a list of those minimum environmental standards. Work with your local authority and local community. It's always useful to read your local climate action plan and transport strategy so that you know what's going to happen around you and what the focus is going to be. Consider your partners and sponsors and whether they match your environmental ambitions. You can have a really good policy, but if you are working with the wrong partner and sponsors, your audiences and others might take away the completely wrong story from being in your space. Speaking to your pension provider and switching to a fund that doesn't invest in fossil fuels. Creating space for nature in your space, so living roofs, bat or swift boxes, wildflowers for pollinators, just looking what you can transfer into green space. On waste and resources, focusing on reducing waste, so looking at reusable cup options. We know that can be a challenge if you don't have space for your washing facilities or storage. If you're in London, I would recommend going to visit Eco Disco, who are trialing a hire system for venues for reusable cups at the moment. They're going to be running a pilot soon. On waste, trying to match what you buy to your waste services. Not everything that's recyclable can or will actually be recycled if it ends up in the wrong place or if it's too contaminated. So have that conversation with your waste management company. Ask them where your waste goes at the end, and therefore buy to make sure that you match your waste service provision. So that's really important in terms of getting smart on bioplastics and other plastic alternatives, because most of them need really specific and dedicated waste solutions, and otherwise they can contaminate recycling or actually make your overall waste management worse than it was before. Again, target not sending any biodegradable waste to landfill if you can. And if you do have a food offer, including plenty of vegetarian and vegan options as part of that, or even going 100% meat and fish free, tracking the percentage of meat free dishes on offer is a really easy way to kind of monitor your progress over time. And also another thing is matching price so that your vegetarian or vegan offering is on a par with your cheapest meat dish as well, is a really useful way to kind of shift behavior. And of course, speaking to your audience and using that platform that you have. So as a kind of strategy hierarchy, measure to understand, avoid emissions by doing things differently, things like avoiding travel, using less where you can, reducing emissions by increasing efficiency, replacing high carbon energy sources with low carbon energy sources, like shifting to renewable energy, and putting a cost on emissions that you can't eliminate, but only as a last resort, and if you're also managing and reducing your carbon footprint in other ways. You can always come back to key principles, like less is generally better. So using less energy in the first place is better than investing in a zero carbon energy source. Reusing existing or reclaimed materials is usually better than purchasing new, even if that new material is sustainably sourced. So focusing on things like natural cooling more than installing a super efficient new air conditioning system that uses refrigerant gases. So again, use what you have, borrow, swap, make, and buy as a last sort of choice in that hierarchy. And if you are buying, always ask follow-up questions to identify greenwashing. Something says environmentally friendly, how so? Biodegradable doesn't have a standard, so always ask, what do you mean by biodegradable? Under what conditions? Recyclable, is it commonly recycled? Can your waste company recycle it? Is that better for the environment? Better than what? What's the alternative? What's it actually being compared to? For buildings, the best solutions don't always have to be the most techie, expensive or high profile. We do a lot of work with different venues that have embarked on capital projects, and actually just focusing on the management, helping the people who work in your venue sort of manage the space in the best way possible, investing in that training at the start, especially if you've installed a new system, to make sure everyone knows how to use it, can have a comparatively much higher impact at a lower cost than some of the sort of low and zero carbon technologies that we find really exciting that can be very expensive. So if you are investing in any capital works, do learn from others. It's worth investing in an energy audit to get your baseline and sort of define clear criteria to assess technologies that are being offered to you, both the investment as well as the maintenance costs later down the line, what the environmental benefits are, and also the technology risks. And do talk to others who've already tried out the options you're considering. When it comes to buying renewable electricity tariffs, also do a bit of research. So the renewables obligation is a law that places an obligation on UK electricity suppliers to source an increasing proportion of electricity they supply from renewable sources. So when energy suppliers are out there touting their green credentials, take it with a pinch of salt. Some of them take that renewables obligation, renewable energy in their generation mix, dress it up and sell it on as a green tariff at a higher cost. And whereas there are other suppliers who are genuinely really trying to invest in additional renewable energy capacity. So if you want to know more about that, Jews Bicycle has an ongoing partnership with Good Energy, who are a smaller 100% renewable electricity supplier. And we've put out this guide on how to buy sustainably sourced renewable electricity for your business and some of the things that you should be looking out for. I just wanted to highlight this example. So since 2012, Jews Bicycle has been working with Arts Council England on an environmental reporting programme. And from that data that we're getting from about 750 organisations every year, we know that it's a small set of very large building-based organisations that are responsible for more than half of the total carbon footprint reported from energy. So we're now working with 30 of those who between them make up a third of the reported energy use and energy use emissions as part of this Spotlight programme. Supporting them on energy management, setting measurable energy and carbon reduction targets using the Science Based Targets Initiative framework. So they're kind of a test bed for a pathway to zero carbon cultural buildings. Again, looking at energy efficiency, getting annual reductions in energy use, electrifying buildings, so switching from gas mainly to heat pumps and getting them off the gas grid, using green electricity on site, or that's locally bought through power purchase agreements or bought via green tariffs. And crucially, I mean, a lot of this is also benefiting from the continued decarbonisation of the UK electricity grid. So over time, more renewable energy is being added to that grid. Another example is Opera North. When they first embarked on their sustainability journey, they nominated their general manager as sustainability lead to have senior accountability. And he's supported by a senior technician, Jamie, who you can see in that picture, who chairs a green team that has cross-department representation. So the green team has a certain freedom to make decisions and also a direct line to two senior members of staff who can sign off things like budgets. They did Julie's Bicycle Creative Green certification to sort of assess where they were and where they wanted to go, and worked with us to create an environmental policy and roadmap. And since then, they've co-founded Sustainable Arts in Leeds, which is a network also working with ITV and other arts and culture and creative institutions in Leeds. They're doing carbon literacy training for all staff and now starting to offer it out to other cultural organisations. They're trialling using more recycled set and costumes for their opera productions. They shifted to a renewable energy tariff, and they're also doing a big capital investment project at the moment with focus on energy reduction. So, for example, they have already changed some of their lighting over from high intensity discharge fixtures to LED, actually achieving a better payback period than they originally thought they would. And are now also looking at solar panels, installing more efficient sort of plant throughout the building, LEDs with passive infrared sensors, and sort of putting themselves on that net zero trajectory. So There is a lot of help available. You can use the Creative Green tools as a place to start measuring your carbon footprint. There's lots of free practical guides and resources, from investing in environmentally sustainable buildings, procurement. We've got a white paper on sort of the Spotlight program, and keep in touch with the live sort of network on next steps from here. And everything we kind of want to reframe, not just into how we reduce our environmental impact, but also how do we bring our creativity to fighting climate change, to work for social justice, to work for livable cities and places, and restoring nature. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Natalie, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the brilliant work that she's been doing at Future Yard.
Hey, thank you very much. That was so informative and elaborate. That was amazing. So my name is Natalie. I am a freelance tour manager and event manager. I am currently the sustainability manager at Future Yard. I'm able to do this because of the Arts Council's Developing Your Creative Practice grant, which is amazing. So for everyone who's listening, those grants are interested in sustainability and, you know, donating to those kind of things. So that's definitely good to get involved with. Next slide, please. So Future Yard is a live music venue, a small independent 350 capacity room. We also have a cafe and a beer garden with an outdoor stage and DJ booth, food truck. We have a traineeship program to get young people working in the music industry. We also have an artist development program and plans to open rehearsal studios for bands in the basement of the building. Next slide, please. So Future Yard is in Birkenhead, which is on the Wirral, just across the Mersey from Liverpool. It's only 2 stops on the underground train from Liverpool Central. So we get audiences that are both local to the Wirral as well as from across the water from Liverpool. So I'll just be talking about what measures we've been able to implement so far and a few things that we want to do in the future. Next slide, please. So I started as a sustainability manager in January. I am also the senior event manager. So some of the things and practices we've come up with, I can implement them in my work directly. So one of the things that we've been doing, which happened before I came in January, was that Future Yard is a case study for the low carbon eco innovatory team at Liverpool John Moores University. So they research sustainable products, practices, and procedures with organizations in the area. So they're doing research for us, which is amazing. So we give them data and they give us advice, basically. So also for those venues listening in today, get in touch with your local universities, because who knows, they might be very keen to help out with your venue as well. So we got 2 researchers helping us. One of them has mainly focused on the building, on the energy, on the construction and infrastructure, and the other one focused on pretty much anything else, but soon found that the main thing is audience travel, as it's such a high percentage of the carbon footprint. Next slide, please. So with the building, after it was acquired in 2020, it started with construction work. So we added insulation into the walls, ceilings, and floors. This is both for retaining heat and lowering our energy, but also to avoid noise pollution. We put a whole new front entrance in at the front of the building, which is all double glazed. We've installed motion sensors for lights across the building. All lights are LED lights, and the stage lights are LED lights as well. And we've got a brand new ventilation system in the live room, which was put in for COVID reasons, but we are planning to install a heat recovery system with that as well. So when hot air gets pulled out of the room, that heat is recovered so that the fresh air that's coming in can be heated up when it comes back in. Next slide, please. So this is the front of the building with the double glazing. It used to be quite closed off. I think there were just a couple of windows in the front doors, but now it has a way more open feel. So yeah, that's our entrance. Next slide, please. Our furniture and infrastructure. So we were able to do socially distant shows in the past month. and we had everyone seated for that. And the furniture we used, the tables and chairs, were all repurposed. Our outdoor furniture are tables and benches where the timber was from renewable sources. We've got a whole structure outside in the garden that is bleachers that people can sit on, and an outdoor stage structure, and they are made from B-grade reused pallets. And we have a DJ booth that is made from a reused shipping container. And the next couple of slides are just the photos of that. So this is the garden. You can see the bleachers on the left and the outdoor stage in the back. So the base of the stage is all pallets as well. And the next slide is the DJ booth. There we go. And yeah, next slide, please. In the dressing room, all the furniture, including the fridge, is all repurposed and reused. So we made sure we weren't tapping into new resources, but that we could avoid things from going to landfill. We have reusable pots in the dressing room because there is a refill store very near to our venue. So some of the rider items we can refill in these reusable pots. We don't give out any disposable plates, cups, or cutlery or anything to our artists. So they're all reusable, they all get washed. We do not have any plastic bottles in the venue, so we do not give disposable water bottles out to the artists. We ask them to bring their own reusable water bottles. So we have water taps in the dressing room where they can refill them. If they do not have reusable water bottles, we provide reusable cups in the dressing room and canned water for the stage. And yeah, so no disposables. And our riders are strictly vegan and vegetarian. We give our meals from our in-house catering, which is all vegan and vegetarian anyway. If artists have specific requests for meat or fish, we apologize and say we can't do that because of our environmental policy, and we offer them alternatives. For example, vegan ham slices rather than real ham slices. Next slide, please. So our food and drink offer across the whole venue, cafe and beer garden. All of our food is vegan and vegetarian. Our pastries come from local bakers and they don't travel very far to get to us. We don't have any plastic bottle drinks available, not water, not soft drinks, not anything. So we just have cans or glass bottles of anything, and draft, of course, draft beer and cider. All of our beers and wines are vegan friendly. Our beer offer is from independent breweries, and many of them are local. We had a local brewery do our very own house Future Yard Pilsner, and the brewery is only half a mile from the venue. So the carbon footprint on that is really low, which is great. The milk for coffees and teas come from a local farm, and it's all in reusable bottles. So whenever we get a delivery, we give the bottles back and they get reused. We have a wide range of alternative vegan milks available, and the soft drinks that we have are all chosen from ethical and sustainable brands so that they align with the values that we have at our venue. For example, one of our soft drinks is Karma drinks. They're all organic, and they have the Karma Foundation where they donate to rainforest initiatives. Next slide, please. And just a few other things that didn't fit in any of the other headlines. So our waste management service is a carbon neutral company. We separate our food waste for them as well, and some of our recycling. They recycled most items at their plants, and they use heat recovery systems. And so their organization has been a carbon neutral organization for years. Our energy provider provides renewable electricity. And in the cafe and beer garden, all receipts are paperless, go via email, as well as our show tickets, our e-tickets that people can show on their phone. Before a show, we take all the posters for that show down that we use to market the shows across the building, and we offer them to the audience for free so that they are repurposed rather than going into recycling. All of our cleaning products are eco-friendly. Some of them come from the refill shop around the corner as well. We try and do little things to raise awareness for environmental issues. For example, you can see the little picture in the top right. So this is a sticker we pop up in our bathroom to kind of raise awareness that you don't just not flush your sanitary products because it can cause problems with the toilet, but also because they can end up in the sea and harm marine life. And then in the future, we've got plans to install bicycle storage. And we really want to start encouraging active travel. So we're just working on how we're going to do that and when. And a couple of other things I forgot to put in the slides as well. We have signed the Music Declares Emergency Pledge, which I can really recommend all of you do. You get lots of information from them as well. And it's just to show that you're dedicated and and as well the Shift Liverpool Pledge. So Shift Liverpool is a brand new sustainability network for the Liverpool City region. And I believe it's now 43 organizations are part of it who all meet up and share what they've been doing and share just great advice with each other. There are many networks like that across the UK. There's Marston, Manchester, and Sale, which was mentioned earlier in Leeds. So I can really recommend that as well. So yeah, that's everything from me. In the next slide, you have my email address if anybody wants to get in touch, and let me know if there's any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Natalie. And I think just picking up on that last point, there really is a lot of help and community out there from the Music Declares Emergency campaign that we've been on the working group of since its creation. Again, organizations like EcoDisco really trying to create solutions for nightlife venues, organizations like JB, like many other sort of consultancies that also offer consultancy for you. And I think there is a real opportunity here through the Live Green Network to do more of that information sharing and exchanging and learning from each other. So thank you so much, Natalie, for sharing what you've done at Future Yard. And I think we've got a little bit of time left for questions, if anyone does want to share any questions and comments. I know we've got a lot of different size venues as well on the call, and I thought it was really important actually to have an example like Future Yard on the call, because quite often I think people feel like, oh, we're too small to do very much. And I think all the work that you're doing sort of really shows that that's not necessarily the case. But yeah, what the solutions are and what you can push for obviously is also going to be really dependent on scale. And I know some of the venues that are listening in are doing some fantastic stuff, sort of working at a much larger scale as well to bring suppliers on board and sort of get them to create new solutions. Yeah, if you have any questions, this is your moment, or even comments or anything you'd like to share, please do so, and we can see them pop up here. We'll let you all gather your thoughts for the time being. While we wait for any questions to come through, I know one question that I've seen come up is this sort of like, well, do I just need to change my supplier straight away? And we've worked with a few companies that have a really great policy of like ask, require, and switch. So acknowledging that we often have established relationships with our contractors, with our suppliers. So starting off by just having a conversation with them and going, this is what we'd like to do. How can you help us? Let's figure it out. And then either they get on board. If they don't, then the next time that contract is up for renewal, you require, so you write something into the contract. And if they're still failing to live up to that, then you switch and go to another supplier. Someone's asked, is there any advice to help venues set science-based targets for reduction against the Live Green Pledge when working to reduce impacts? Has already been happening. So it's a little bit tricky. The Science-Based Target Initiative framework, for those who don't know, is an initiative that's supported by WWF and a few other, the World Resources Institute and a few other sort of big NGOs to try and help businesses set targets. And they have a few different, what they call roadmaps for different parts of the economy. And the one that's closest to us is the service industry, which really looks at buildings. But they really work on a linear basis. So if you're an SME, which a majority of companies are, to sign up to a science-based target with the Science-Based Target Initiative framework, it takes the the year baseline and then applies a linear reduction year by year. So if you signed up for a science-based target that follows a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory now, I think it's a 47% or something, between a 40 and a 50% reduction by 2030 that you have to achieve. If you've already invested a lot, then basically you don't get credit for that, which can seem unfair to some of us, but at the same time, I think is an acknowledgement that achieving sort of that halving of reductions every 10 years from now, like we don't get to just sit back just because we've already been working at it. Actually, we all need to step forward and keep pushing more. So yeah, but if you, as part of kind of a follow-up to this, yeah, I would recommend you can look at the Science Based Target Initiative website, and there's an SME target setting letter that sort of sets out your roadmap for how that works. Lee has asked, what do you feel are the key actions venues can do to influence industry-wide change collaboratively with other venues and those key holders often out of our direct control? I think there are a few things on that. I guess it depends on what you're referring to when you mean out of your direct control. I think if you're talking about the tours and productions, for example, that are traveling to you, then actually Live Green as a framework and network is really that opening up of that conversation. And we've had some great sessions, a great session on touring a little while ago, which again is sort of how do we open up that conversation more between venues and the productions they receive so that everyone starts working towards the same targets and actually recognizes what's already being worked on. Because I think what happens a lot is artists and productions will say, well, we'd love to do this, but we can't because it's all down to the venues or the festivals, the promoters. You get the venues, the festivals and promoters kind of saying, well, we'd love to do this, but to be honest, we're just not sure we can get the artists and the tours on board. So you end up in this weird stalemate where no one has that first conversation. So I think what Live is hopefully doing is creating that space. In terms of other key holders out of direct control, I think a big one is working through Live to put this much more on the agenda as well of some of the policymakers. So lobbying for things that are going to enable us to meet our targets. Again, some of that is going to be, we need central government investment into public transport. We need better central government structures to help co-finance investment into renewable energy and energy efficiency and sort of, again, getting our venues off the gas grid. The few UK government schemes there was a thing called the Green Deal for commercial properties. It didn't work. Take-up was really low. And actually, you know, it's time to go back. What are our financing options? You know, even if it's low or zero interest loans to help finance some of this investment that we're going to have to make into our built environment. I think that's a really big one. And then something about if we're all singing from the same hymn sheet as well to audiences. And again, everyone sort of puts the public transport information first. You make sure it's included in, you know, the ticket sale information, like how are you going to travel actively? Then you can start reinforcing the idea of, oh, I can go out to my local venue using public transport. I don't have to take the car. A question for you, Natalie, from Steve. How have artists responded to vegan-only riders?
Really well, actually. So it's not just vegan only, we do vegetarian as well. So our options for dinner from our food truck do have halloumi in some of them, but we have lots of vegan options there. And yeah, so one of the bands we got a rider through that did have like a meat slices on it for a sandwich and smoked salmon. And I just told them, you know, I can replace them with other things that are nice on sandwiches, but I still gave them all the cheese slices that they requested. And they were really happy with it. They didn't complain about it at all. And just as a sort of positive thing that I've been experiencing doing these socially distant shows, so many more bands are specifically requesting vegan food on their riders as well. So there is a change coming from young bands, and it's something they expect from us as well. So in both ways, when they requested meat and they didn't get it, we still had a positive conversation about it, but also many aren't requesting any meat and fish, and I it warms my heart.
Fantastic. So we're kind of going with a flow that's already shifting, aren't we? Another question from Alexander's, which is the front of the building now has a lot of glazing. Did you run into any noise level leakage issues with that?
It's a good question. We haven't, as far as I'm aware, but it's also, so there's the glass front, and then we have the cafe, and then we have the live room. So between, the glass front and the live room is another double wall, because we have double doors as well. In between the double doors is our box office. So we haven't come across any noise leakage there. You can barely hear the band in the cafe, so you can't hear it outside, really.
I think there's been some really interesting work that different venues have also done, trying to use more, the technical term is green infrastructure, to help with sound dimming. I know Village Underground's sort of living roof, which is a massive layer of soil and plants on the roof. One of the reasons they installed that was for soundproofing purposes. And actually, they didn't just want to put a concrete slab on the roof. They really went to a lot of effort to go, okay, we can do this by just putting a lot of soil on instead. There used to be a venue in Camden as well that had a green wall, which can also help, again, with sort of sound dampening. The plants do pick up quite a lot. Harker wants to know, how do you go about encouraging audience transport changes? I can go first and then I'll pass on to you, Natalie, as well. I think, again, some of it is just making sure that you have the information there very easily accessible on your how to get to the venue, that you don't start with the car travel directions. You actually start with, these are directions from the nearest train station. These are the buses that come by. This is how you walk. This is where the nearest bicycle lockup is, especially if you can't offer any bicycle lockups near to you, so that people don't have to go looking for that information. Again, I think it can be really worth, so either doing an audience travel survey or yourself doing a little bit of research, but also if you do an audience travel survey, asking people how they got to the venue and also asking them like what's stopping you from traveling differently. So I know the Newcastle and Gateshead cultural venues used to come together as a network and do a joint audience travel survey, actually as all the venues in the area. And they also asked about barriers to public transport use, and a really big one that came out was, of course, timing and when the last services went, as a barrier for why more people weren't using them. But it gave the cultural venues as a whole kind of a lot of information to take to the public transport providers and to the local authority and go, look, we're here, we're with you on trying to shift people's behavior, but actually the services you provide at the moment are a barrier and people are saying they're a barrier. What would it take to expand the services, by this amount of time either end? Or if that doesn't work, again, also looking at your own set times and finish times. If you might not be able to move things by a whole hour, but actually if you moved things by 15 minutes and that makes the difference as to whether people can get the last bus or the last train, then that's really, really worth doing. And otherwise, again, if you can, making it more difficult or making it seem less desirable, I'm say there's limited parking. Don't take your car. You won't be able to park it somewhere. Over exaggerate how difficult the parking might be as well. I think, which, and that one thing to say is that doesn't have to conflict as well with your accessibility strategy. So as long as you've got really clear information as well about people who have to drive and how they can get to the venue. But as long as you're trying to make it not the default. And then some venues, depending on your size, have been successful as well at getting agreements with their local public transport providers. It's not as common in the UK, but I know the Sage Gateshead, for example, does, if you have a ticket to an event, I think you get free tram travel or metro travel an hour before and after the show, included with that ticket, because they have a local agreement. Natalie, I don't know whether you have anything to add on that.
So as I explained, Birkenhead is across the river from Liverpool, and Birkenhead hasn't had a live music venue since I don't know when. So we are dependent on audience coming from Liverpool as well. So part of our marketing campaign for that was, it's only 2 stops by the underground train. and it's fairly cheap as well. I think if people come with their car from Liverpool, they have to go through a tunnel that has toll on both ends. So hopefully that's a bit of a barrier as well to choose public transport rather than car. And as I said, we want to invest in secure bicycle parking facilities so that we can encourage that. And we're working on doing some initiatives. We haven't decided on it yet, but something like, you know, you get rewarded when you come with your bike or you come walking. And, you know, it's still thinking about how can we track that and what is the reward. I heard from another venue, they did something about like, show us on your phone how many steps you've taken in the last hour so they can show that they actually walk there, which is quite interesting. But yeah, things like that, just having the right facilities for people to actually do that. And as well, our socially distant shows all finished well before the last train to both the Wirral and to Liverpool. So.
Brilliant, thanks Natalie. One more question from Simon. You mentioned water in cans. What product was that, please?
Okay, we've had two different ones. The one we have now is Radnor, so Radnor, and they come in sort of 330 milliliter cans. Before we've had Can-O Water, which they do provide resealable cans as well, but I basically advise the bars manager on the product, and he then chooses, you know, what is available and the cost of it. So for some reason, we made a switch to the Radnor cans, and they've been well received by the artists as well.
Brilliant, thanks. And I mean, the one other thing I would say with that as well is if you are switching to cans again, just double checking maybe where they're going, because if cans are good when they get recycled, when they don't get recycled, there's a lot of energy that goes into making a can. So for example, if all your waste just goes to energy from waste and it doesn't get sorted, then switching to cans might not be the right choice. And one more question from Peter. At Wembley, we've worked with you before. Do you still carry out studies and venues to ascertain our current position and highlight potential to improve over some of these areas? Yes, we do. That's the certification Creative Green that we still run. Absolutely. So yeah, anyone who wants to find out more about that can get in touch with us at Judy's Bicycle. And I think that's it on the questions. Thank you so much for everyone tuning in. If you have any other questions, I think, Natalie, you've kindly offered to receive them by email. And me as well, if you want to email Chiara@judy'sbicycle.com on anything. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for a lively discussion, for tuning in, for spending your time with us today. And we hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.